Hello, good morning, and thank you everyone for coming to this talk. This is How the West Was Many, Crafting a Culturally Diverse Western with Rosewater. I'm Jess Haskins. Just a little bit about my background. I am a narrative designer and writer. I'm a game editor primarily and founder of the Game Editors. I'm an adjunct professor of game design at the NYU Game Center. I'm a community organizer and advocate for indie devs, NYC game devs, and educators. And most pertinent to today, I am a co-writer on this game, Rosewater, which is a forthcoming point-and-click Western-themed adventure game by Grundislav Games. So this talk is really the third part in a series about world building and representation that I've given over the years here at Narrascope and elsewhere. In The Politics of World Building, I spoke about the importance of writing with cultural awareness and embedding your values in your work. In World Building Out of Bounds, I discussed why small teams and solo indies especially shouldn't be afraid to write characters outside their own personal backgrounds, and I offered some advice for doing so responsibly. So in this talk, I'll share how our team of two put this theory into practice in making Rosewater, which is our biggest, most ambitious, and most culturally diverse game so far. So here's a quick overview of where we'll be going in this talk. First, I'll do a short summary of those best practices in the theory section, and then we'll move on to how that theory worked in practice with Rosewater as a case study. So doing that, we'll look at three phases of story development, from the initial writing and design to soliciting outside review and feedback, to the process of casting and recording voice actors. That's not the end of development, but that is the point where the writing is effectively locked and done. And then finally, we'll just recap with a summary and some conclusions from the experience. So I do need to pause to make a quick content notice. This talk will contain generalized references to historical violence and oppression, particularly including colonialism and genocide in the Americas. Just wanted you to be aware of that. So with that said, let's dive in with some quick theory highlights. So these are basically my key best practices for responsible representation. Craft characters with diverse intersectional identities and endow them with agency. Cultivate awareness of problematic tropes and stereotypes so that you can be aware of and avoid them. Do your research, kind of inevitable. And beware of building narratives on identity-based trauma. And engage cultural consultants, that is, people who have the relevant perspective to advise on aspects of representation in your work, and be prepared to pay them. And finally, practice authentic voice casting. So a couple of these points I do want to pause to consider in slightly more detail before moving on. So on this first point, I'm especially indebted to the work of game developers and theorists like Meg Janth and Maddie Bryce, who have spoken about decentering the player as an anti-colonialist design practice, refusing the power fantasy of being uniquely able to save or dominate a world built just for you. This talk by Meg Janth about the writing in 80 days, I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. It was really influential for both of us. So in my own work, I reframe this concept slightly as giving agency to secondary characters who aren't the player or protagonist. That means they have their own problems that the hero can't fix, and their own internal life and motivations that aren't available for the player to access or manipulate. This attitude runs counter to a lot of the traditional structures of both Westerns with their individualistic, masculine savior narratives and adventure games, whose NPCs are so often instrumentalized as tools to use or obstacles to remove. So it definitely takes some intentionality to recognize and break out of these familiar patterns. So one more point worth pausing on for a moment. So some tips like do research and don't do a stereotype are fairly obvious, but this one can get a little more gnarly. Beware of building your narrative on a foundation of identity-based trauma. So for this recommendation, I lean on sources like the best practice guidelines developed by Represent Me, which is a nonprofit working with the game industry to support marginalized communities. And this warning cautions us not to accomplish our goal of representing members of marginalized groups by appropriating narratives of their trauma for dramatic effect. You can put a character with a particular identity in your story without making the story about all the terrible things they have to suffer because of that identity. So in practice, this balance becomes a little more complicated. Aren't stories about conflict? Isn't it harmful to pretend that sexism or racism or homophobia or whatever history of oppression doesn't exist by omitting it from your work? But there is a difference between acknowledging something exists and hanging your story on it. Trauma is, a sensitive thing, and unless you know whereof you speak, you're going to want to tread lightly. So, on to how this theory served us in practice while we were developing Rosewater. So Rosewater is an adventure set in an alternate history world inspired by the American Old West. You play as Harley Legere, a former pugilist and street tough, trying to make a new life for herself as a writer. She joins a posse of odd companions on a journey across Western Vespuccia in search of an eccentric inventor's lost fortune, or at least a good story. One of our goals was to thoughtfully depict a diverse range of people and experiences often left out of traditional Westerns, with an ethnically, age, and gender diverse cast. So I'll try not to make it too spoilery, or at least not past the demo, which is currently free on Steam. So to give you an idea of what the game's about, let's take a quick look at the trailer.
Tell me, what is it you want out of life? Fortune, glory, the thrill of adventure? I'm offering you a chance at all three. You just need to do me one small favor. You've something of a reputation, Clever, resourceful, maybe a little dangerous. I do hope that's accurate. The path won't be straightforward. You'll encounter obstacles along the way, perhaps even some other dangerous people. You'll need some help, but I assure you the rewards far outweigh the risks. You will be richer than you ever thought possible, if you can deliver. I'll be in touch.
Please ignore that date. So, since I'm talking about how we handled representation, I'll briefly mention the personal backgrounds we do bring to the project, the identities we could authentically represent from our own experience. So, Francisco and I are both straight, cisgendered, white, able-bodied, middle-class Americans currently living in New York City. My ancestry is English, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I have roots in both the American South, around Georgia in particular, where my mother's family is from, and in the West. My father was born and raised on his parents' homestead in Nevada, in a community of miners and ranchers. My understanding of the Old West is influenced by written and oral family histories and visits we made to the old homestead, and also by my father's abiding fondness for Westerns. He always wanted to know when I was going to make a Western game, so I really hope he likes this one. Francisco's heritage is Cuban. He grew up bilingual in Miami, immersed in Cuban and Hispanic culture, while also exposed to American culture and not always knowing how to self-identify. He experienced this feeling of being torn between two cultures and wanted to intentionally explore that dynamic in Rosewater. And while not inherently a fan of Westerns, he was drawn to the theme of the West as a place to start fresh and forge a new identity, the myth of the virgin territory that we engage with and try to complicate in our story. So that's what we bring to these stories and why we wanted to tell them. So here's how we actually got down to it, starting with the writing and design process. First up, crafting characters. Everything in Rosewater really comes down to your relationship with the 5 main companion characters. Diversity was important to us, obviously. On a basic gameplay level, we wanted to give the companions differing and complementary attitudes and skills so that each had a distinct worldview and role without a lot of overlap. The healer, the sharpshooter, the talker, and so on. On a representational level, we wanted them to reflect the multiculturalism of the Old West, looking beyond the taciturn lone cowboy hero figure and the white settler perspective more generally. We also wanted to make sure that each companion in some way broke out of or challenged stereotypical roles found in many Westerns. So let's meet them. Gentleman Jake Ackerman is one of the first companions you meet. He's a showman loosely modeled after historical figures like Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill. He's a stage performer who reenacts and reinforces legends of frontier heroism and rugged masculinity. In our cast, he is in fact the very embodiment of the traditional white male cowboy hero, although our Jake is a chatterbox, definitely not taciturn. He reflects the dominant culture perspective and occasionally serves as a foil for characters who don't enjoy his privileges. While Jake's more problematic attitudes don't pass without critique, we really didn't want him to be the stubborn, heteronormative white guy, the throwback whose blinkered worldview would make him the punching bag of our enlightened modern narrative. We took care to write him with the same sympathy and dignity we accorded every other character. You may find you like Jake, or you may not, and both positions are equally valid. We knew that we wanted the Chinese immigrant community represented in our Western, and Danny Luo is our window into that experience. As with many of the companions, Danny exists between two cultures and is on a journey to find his place in the world. He's the second-generation son of immigrant parents, born and raised in the Chinatown of El Presidio, our analog to San Francisco. He is somewhat estranged from his roots. He's fallen in with a rough crowd and left his family and community behind. As the youngest member of the group, Danny contributes his skills as an expert gunslinger and all-around helpful guy. And he also cooks a mean pot of chili. When we first meet Danny, he's in the role of Jake's stage assistant, but we very consciously decided we wouldn't slot him into the role of this subservient second fiddle character. His story arc is really about growing beyond this limited identity as just the sidekick and coming into his own as a hero and the protagonist of his own journey. So General Filomeno Marquez, or Phil, is our new Spanish companion character. By 1850, when our game is set, the Age of Revolution had largely never occurred in our world. Instead of the independent countries of Mexico and the US, we have New Spain and the Commonwealth of Vespuccia, still part of the Spanish and British empires, respectively. And now a popular insurgency has arisen in New Spain, led by General Marquez, and his character arc revolves around his role at the center of this struggle. With Phil's character, we wanted to challenge the stereotype of the cynical Mexican revolutionary who doesn't really have any principles or who is just as bad as the enemy that he fights against. So on the contrary, Phil's revolutionary politics are quite genuine. He comes from a wealthy aristocratic family who probably don't approve much of his life choices. He was educated as a civil engineer and radicalized abroad at a European university. So that's where he picked up a new leftist worldview to bring home and put into action, along with a handy skill with explosives. So if you need something blown up, whether it's a building or the oppressive mantle of imperialism, Phil's your guy. Nadine Redbird is another companion who straddles two worlds, but doesn't quite belong to either of them. Nadine was orphaned at a young age and raised in Rosewater as the ward of the town doctor, Doc Sedgwick. Her heritage is indigenous, but she doesn't know who her people are or where she comes from. Her arc is about coming to terms with that uncertainty and finding a place where she feels at home. She's never traveled beyond the valley, so she's something of an innocent abroad. And in this, she's a contrast with Harley, who has grown cynical in her travels and never looked to put down roots. So while Nadine serves as the medic of the group, it was important to us that we not fall into native healer tropes, having her exhibit some innate mystical connection to nature or spout profound-sounding platitudes. Nadine was informally trained as Doc Sedgwick's assistant and is skilled in the latest modern techniques. In fact, her working knowledge of things like germ theory and the importance of hand washing put her right on the cutting edge of medicine in 1850. Finally, we come to Lola Johnson, the group's driver and tracker. She owns the wagon you're traveling in, and like Harley, has spent most of her life on the move. She originally comes from the South in the province of Dixie, and she was drawn westward by the promise of freedom, independence, and having lots of wide, open country between her and other people. She's a prickly loner and a very private person. Getting to know her takes time, patience, and a healthy respect for her boundaries. But if you do form a strong bond with Lola, that doesn't mean she'll open up like a flower and reveal all her secrets. This is an instance where we designed with the character's agency very much in mind. Lola isn't a puzzle for you to crack. Her private life isn't a prize for you to win. She's on her own journey and she keeps her own counsel, but if you're lucky, she may call you a friend. So I've talked already about some of the tropes that we took care to steer clear of. But it is important to acknowledge that trope isn't a bad word. Tropes are the building blocks of stories, and if you try to write without using any, you'll have a tough time. But some tropes are harmful, especially if used thoughtlessly. These include tropes that perpetuate negative stereotypes or treat certain kinds of people as less than human. One of those harmful tropes we almost fell into was this pretty well-known one called bury your gays. This is where some small amount of positive representation seems to be achieved by the inclusion of queer characters, but then they get killed off and don't get to enjoy a happy ending or any kind of future at all. This is a big bummer, and you shouldn't do it. In fact, we did commit this trope already in Lamplight City, where we killed our only major queer character, Bill, in the introductory scene of the game. So we didn't want to do that again. So avoiding spoilers here, we had a part of our story where certain characters could die depending on choices you made. We realized that in one instance, that death would mean breaking up a queer couple. So we rewrote it so that character couldn't die, but would just be taken out of action for the rest of the game. Our queer love story wouldn't be saddled with this tragic ending. So if we hadn't been looking out for harmful tropes, we might have missed it, but thankfully we were able to catch it in time and write around it. So, doing the research. It should go without saying that whenever you're venturing beyond the limits of your personal background and knowledge, you have to do your research. Educate yourself and do what you can on your own, then check your work and refine it with the help of consultants. For us, this was especially important for everything involving our indigenous characters and cultures. One key location in the game is an indigenous village located near Rosewater. The first challenge was just figuring out what tribe or nation we should attempt to depict. Since we have an alt history setting, we very briefly considered but quickly ruled out the idea of creating a fictional tribe. That felt lazy and disrespectful. If we wouldn't create a European capital or an industrial eastern seaboard city from whole cloth, there was no excuse to do so for an indigenous culture just because one was familiar to us and one was not. So to avoid all this, we needed to learn something about the actual indigenous peoples who would have inhabited our region analogous to Southern California circa 1850. We started with this interactive map developed by Native Land Digital, available at native-land.ca. This is a fantastic, thoughtfully crafted tool that shows the approximate regions of the shifting and overlapping indigenous territories, languages, and treaties over time. You can see at a glance that this map is extremely complex and not at all straightforward. These are not stable, well-defined, official political entities with clear borders. The notion of the modern nation-state simply doesn't apply. And we lacked the cultural expertise we really needed to navigate this map, but it was still a helpful starting point. We eventually determined that the indigenous population near Rosewater would be part of the Odom people. That gave us a starting point for researching names, visual references, and cultural details to portray the village and its inhabitants. The flip side to research is in those moments of departure from historical accuracy, or in other words, just making stuff up. and both methods have their place. Some people choose to write alt historical fiction out of a deep interest in history and a desire to explore counterfactual what-if scenarios in detail. What if this important battle had gone another way? What if this major turning point changed because of some small random happenstance? But neither of us are historians, and that is very much not where our interest lies. So what do we get out of using an alt historical setting? One, we get to play with fantastical elements, like our hand-wavy, pseudoscientific, quasi-magical, etheric technology. Once that's in the picture, we've already left reality behind. And if you have some fantastically powerful new kind of technology or supernatural ability in your world, and its history doesn't look any different, then that's pretty weird and kind of strains belief. We also do it for the fun of creating something novel by remixing familiar elements in new combinations. A good example is New Britannia, the titular lamplight city of our previous game. It's kind of a mix of London, New York, and New Orleans, basically some of our favorite cities all rolled into one. But our alt historical setting also lets us gloss over questions of historical accuracy when getting it right either isn't interesting to us or is simply beyond our reach. Any detail we introduce that doesn't mesh well with the historical record or seems anachronistic or is just plain wrong, well, that's just the alternate part of alt history. It's a handy safety valve that we've relied on plenty of times. Coming back to our depiction of indigenous peoples, we exercised our alt history prerogative as far as partially rewriting the history of the New World. Rather than recapitulating the historical trajectory of extermination, removal, and confinement to a few small reservations in the West, we decided that the Odom Nation would be one of numerous sovereign indigenous nations stretching across the continent. We didn't totally erase history, but we tipped the balance of power, at least a little. So why did we make that change? I have to say, partly it's down to the fact that I just had a hard time imagining having fun in a historical Western setting, a kind of playground. This is a game, after all, where genocide was happening just off screen, but went unacknowledged. We certainly didn't want to do some Disney-fied revisionist fairy tale, like those myths they like to tell American school children about a blissfully harmonious first Thanksgiving, where the colonists were kind, welcome new neighbors, and everyone got along. But on the other hand, per our guidance about trauma-based narratives, we knew we weren't equipped to tell a story about the catastrophic genocidal colonialist campaign in the Americas, even if we had wanted to. So we tried to thread that needle, acknowledging these historical dynamics in our story, without either ignoring them or letting our tale get engulfed by them. We tried to show a glimpse of complex, fraught intercultural relations that were still in flux and still in conflict. Really, this is a problem inherent to the entire category of the Western as an entertainment genre, and arguably to the concept of the United States itself as a place to exist and as a country. I have to admit that I just don't really have the solution to that one, but we did our best. So we have our writing and our outline. On to the next stage of development, review, and feedback. After we have the story designed and drafted, it's time to bring some other brains in, particularly a range of cultural consultants who can review our work from a place of familiarity with a particular background or identity we're trying to represent. One source we turned to was friends. Danny's story was one where we definitely needed outside help. So we asked for feedback from several friends who could speak about the experience of being raised in America with a culturally Chinese background. We got very good notes that helped us add authentic details and avoid some embarrassing mistakes, although I'm sure we still committed a few. For instance, we originally named this character Danny Lo, L-O, until we were told that would be a Taiwanese name and we should change it to L-U-O if Danny was supposed to be from mainland China. So we made that change. A friend also posed some questions about Danny's backstory that made us rethink some assumptions. Danny spent most of his young adult life on the road, and his arc, as I mentioned, involved a certain estrangement from his roots. As originally conceived, he was an orphan, without family or community. And our cultural reviewer posed the very reasonable question, why? Why doesn't he have a family? We realized that we didn't have a very good answer. In fact, our cast had other orphan characters already, like Nadine. Too many. So since family and filial relationships are such an important part of Chinese culture, it didn't feel right to leave those out of Danny's story. So we resurrected Danny's parents, but still kept some of that distance, which strengthened the story by adding an emotional element. Now, instead of having no roots to speak of, he carries the weight of a voluntary separation from his parents, feeling like a disappointment with nothing to offer, with the guilty tug of being away for too long and not contacting them enough. So with this change, he became a more grounded, believable, and interesting character. So from the beginning, we knew we wanted to hire a professional sensitivity reader or cultural consultant who could address aspects of especially Indigenous representation in our game. And unfortunately, this is one place where we really did fall short. One route we tried was looking for professional sensitivity readers from the literary world, consultation services specializing in representation and sensitivity or diversity edits, like Salt and Sage Books, connect authors with reviewers matching a wide variety of self-identified backgrounds and identities. So we inquired about finding reviewers affiliated with the Odom, but unfortunately they didn't have anyone on their roster matching that background. And we didn't have other similar resources in mind to approach. Aside from literary editors, another path we tried was directly contacting the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Cultural Center and Museum, using the contact information on their respective websites. We also identified people connected with those institutions and reached out to them individually via Twitter. Here's an example of a message we sent saying that we were working on an independent video game that featured Odom characters and we're hoping for help connecting with someone who might be interested in working with us as a paid cultural consultant. We followed up a couple times, but we didn't receive any response. So we were disappointed, but not terribly surprised or upset. We had no existing relationship with these people or a basis for trust. We hadn't done anything to prove our credentials or good faith. We gave it a shot, but when that failed, again, we didn't have a good backup plan. So what could we have done better to make this part work? Well, we knew that finding paid cultural consultants was a recommended best practice, but this was the first time we had tried to actually carry it out. We really just underestimated the effort it would take to follow through. We could have developed a more systematic strategy. We hadn't done the investigative work to deepen our list of resources beyond a few initial leads. And when we didn't find exactly what we wanted, we gave up too soon without widening the search parameters. Finally, we just needed to allocate more time to the whole process. Eventually, time for this phase ran out, and we had to finalize content and move on. While we did manage to bring in more people than we ever had before to consult on an informal basis, which was a win, we still have more work to do to live up to our aspirations on this one. So finally, the last phase in this process, recording VO and working directly with actors. So authentic casting was key here. We had a lot of different identities represented in our game, so authentic casting was essential. Authentic casting means ensuring characters are voiced by actors who share their backgrounds or identities, and at a bare minimum, avoiding stereotypical cartoon accents or casting white actors in other ethnicities. That happens too often in the industry, but as more developers make the conscious choice to practice authentic casting, it is getting better. We're extremely proud of our cast and the amazing work that they did. This is really our dream cast. We made a wish list and were floored when they all said yes. Some were actors we sought out because we were already familiar with their work, but many of them we discovered when we went looking specifically for actors with certain backgrounds and identities. We cast many of our actors through this wonderful resource called PGM, People of the Global Majority VO List. You have to sign up as a producer to browse the database, and then you can search and filter to find actors by criteria like gender identity, ethnicity, tribal affiliation, neurodiversity, age, repertoire of accents, union status, a whole bunch of really detailed criteria. We were able to cast most of our companion characters and many other NPCs using this site, which we highly recommend. And I'll stop there, but if you are interested in hearing more about how we did the casting, be sure to catch Francisco's talk about going union later today. So while we didn't want to get in the habit of treating our voice actors as last-ditch sensitivity readers, asking them for comment on any lingering issues of representation when they turn up for recording, we did want to leave room for them to make modifications and influence their character through performance. In, used to be the booth, now post-pandemic era, it's just a Zoom room. For instance, Danny is voiced by the wonderful Matt Yang King, who, as we found, was literally one of the fathers of steampunk. Such an honor to have him. So we didn't give him a lot of direction on what Danny should sound like because we weren't sure, honestly, what would be right. So based on the character's age and history, Matt came up with an appropriate accent and voice right there in the recording session. So here's what that sounded like.
So Danny is a 21-year-old Chinese-American kid. He's basically the kid brother who wants to prove himself.
Sort of in between. There's a little bit of an in between. So maybe like a tinge of something from his parents, but then he's there. And he's 21, so he's a little bit younger and higher. But maybe he's been around the block too many times. He's been shouting in a lot of saloons and halls. So maybe there's a bit of fry to his voice, right? Because he's been burning out his voice on various different places, right? Because, I mean, the whole thing is you got that presentational, the sun beat down upon them as the duelists stood and stared, right? That sort of.
Yeah.
Right.
And now we have Danny's voice. So based on those choices, we even made a few further tweaks to the character. For instance, we originally wrote Danny as primarily an English speaker with limited fluency in Mandarin. But because Matt chose to give Danny an accent, we decided that Mandarin would have been the language he spoke at home growing up, and we rewrote him as being fully fluent in both languages. Another place where we successfully left extra room for our voice actors was in the writing for Phil. It is a somewhat common trope, especially with Spanish-speaking characters for some reason, to pepper their speech with random words and exclamations in their native tongue, no matter how fluent they are in English. And I can't say we did much to buck that trend. But we did have a native Spanish speaker on the writing team who was able to insert mostly appropriate Spanish words and phrases, whereas there was no similar temptation to have, say, Danny busting out phrases in Chinese because we couldn't write that. Also, maybe that would have been a little too Firefly. So there were certain lines of Phil's that I left completely alone and just let Francisco draft. But Francisco's familiarity is with Cuban, not Mexican Spanish, so he couldn't write it with full authority either. So in a few cases, we just left placeholders in the script, like suitably odd exclamation in Spanish in reaction to something astonishing and a little horrifying. When we got to the recording session with Christian Lands, voice of Phil, we let him know up front that he should feel free to modify the lines as written and insert more appropriate Mexican phrases and exclamations that felt authentic to him, which he was happy to do. So here's a little snippet of that.
Arriba! That was beautiful! I'm going to change arriba to something more colloquial, if that's okay.
That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
I never really liked it myself.
All right. Carajo! That was beautiful!
But it turns out that leaning on our actors to fill script holes was not always the right move. Coming back to Danny, one experiment which very much did not work was our attempt to record scenes with characters speaking to each other in Mandarin. This is another of the warts and all parts of the presentation where we reveal the really dumb mistakes that we made so you don't have to. Our idea was that after capturing the script as written in English, we'd use extra time remaining in our session to have the actors interpret the lines into Mandarin on the fly and try to get both versions so we had them as options to use. Our voice actors were fluent in Mandarin and agreed beforehand to trying this out, so we figured it was worth a shot. But what I just described isn't interpretation. Interpretation, which Francisco is quite familiar with and has actually performed professionally, is a fluid and imperfect process of facilitating live communication between speakers of different languages. It turns out that what we were really asking for was on-the-spot literary translation, rendering text from one language into another in a crystallized, polished form for publication. That is a completely different and far more involved undertaking, not to be done on the spot, and definitely not a voice actor's job. What's more, even if we somehow had gotten perfect, professional quality translations from these sessions, we'd never be able to use them without an editor on our end remotely capable of manipulating them. A few minutes in, we realized that figuring out what parts of the audio corresponded to what English line, or even recognizing the usable takes, was completely impossible without working knowledge of the language, obvious in hindsight. It was a completely misguided notion and an unfair request to make of our voice actors, who, to their credit, were very game and perfectly delightful to work with. The only saving grace is that we were just trying it out as an experiment, and we quickly aborted when we realized how far out at sea we were. In the end, we just put the on-screen text in brackets to indicate that it represented translated speech. That worked just fine, and it didn't involve asking anyone to operate outside of their expertise or job description. So let's take a moment to talk about dialect. Dialect is hard. Most of the advice out there is to just avoid it as much as possible, because when it goes wrong, it's so easy to come off as ignorant and offensive. We have a number of characters with Irish or Irish Vespuccian backgrounds, for instance. The fake Irish accent is a common offender and the scourge of anyone who cares about what Irish people actually sound like. So, how to avoid that trap? Well, I used a few of the methods from our list to help, like authentic casting and good old research. I read plenty about the evils of bad cartoony accents and things to avoid, and looked for resources that described some features of real Irish speech I could work in. I took to heart advice about minimizing use of non-standard spellings and conveying regional flavor through things like syntax and word choice instead. I went through an agonizing back and forth process with lots of examples of dialect in the script, waffling over every choice between the in or ing endings in all the Western, Southern, and Irish accented lines, which in our script is a good portion of them. And to be fair, I probably still went too deep, and I could have scaled the dialect back even more. For one thing, unlike, say, a book, all our dialogue is fully voiced and is meant to be listened to. The player doesn't have to imagine a character saying goin' instead of going, because they're most likely going to hear it. If we want a voice actor to say goin' instead of going, then all we really have to do is work out, like we did with the voice of Danny, how the character should sound, and then let them lop off those G's naturally as they go, which may or may not happen in exactly the same place as I anticipated when I was writing the script and struggling to project this accent, which is not my own, in my head. After recording, we have to go through a whole process anyway of matching the written text to the line as recorded, adding contractions, lopping off those ing endings, or whatever else is needed to make the text fully match how it actually came out in the final take. So there's still probably too much dialect in our script, but not as much as there would have been if I hadn't at least tried to follow this advice. And yet, here's another one of my missteps. We were fortunate enough to have Roger Clark, Red Dead Redemption 2's Arthur Morgan, on our cast. And we even got to have him use his own natural Irish accent for one of our characters. The night before our session, I was inhaling all these guides about writing Irish dialect and second-guessing all my choices and changing goings to goings and ye's to you's and back. I thought I did a pretty okay job. Then we get in the Zoom session with Roger, and he goes, "You know, the Irish ye is only for the plural, so you really wouldn't say it to just one person." He was totally lovely about it and a complete pro, and would have read whatever we put on the page, of course, even if it was Irish nonsense from top to bottom, whatever he actually personally thought of it. But I was mortified because I'd tried so hard to get it right and committed a pretty glaring error. And there it is. You can look at it right there. Ugh. And also, I did kind of know that already, actually. The problem was that this character wasn't just Irish, he was also a sea captain, and his character was conceived as, imagine the vocal equivalent of a cartoon Irish accent and a cartoon pirate accent, which is really a cartoon West Country accent, thanks Treasure Island for that indelible stereotype, thrown together in a burlap sack and fighting it out like cats and dogs. Just an incoherent mess of dialects. So I tried to explain to Roger, no, some of those ye's aren't really the Irish plural ye, they're the nautical piratey yeah. But by that point, it was just too late to make any more changes, and we kind of had to roll with it. So, wrapping up, what did we learn from all of this experience? Well, the good parts. We did achieve a diverse cast of characters that we managed to populate using authentic casting with a fantastic cast. I believe that we achieved positive, nuanced representations and avoided negative stereotypes in our characters. We successfully embedded progressive themes and diverging perspectives into our story. And we were able to solicit and use really helpful feedback from several informal cultural consultants. The bad, the big one is that we failed to locate and hire paid cultural consultants, which was really a big touchstone of ours, something we were really trying to do. And we did not manage to get any review from an Indigenous cultural perspective. I kind of hope that the work stands alone without that, but I would have felt a lot better about it if we did have that step, of course. We probably could have used some dialect editors or scaled dialect back a little bit more than we did. And in the moment, we made some unreasonable requests of actors before we walked those back. And the things we'll keep thinking about. Next time, we will definitely allocate more time and energy for this process of researching and recruiting consultants, which is not as simple or straightforward as we originally expected. We probably won't be making another Western story again, you never know, but man, colonialism sure does ruin everything, doesn't it? And finally, the last point, which is kind of the lesson that I hope people take away from this, is that you don't have to engage with this process perfectly and make no mistakes to make it worth doing. We had some wins, we had some misses. Overall, I hope that the work is stronger for it, and we're going to keep iterating and learning from this process. So I'm always wary of the kind of talk that goes, this is how you should do things, although I've certainly done that in the past. I think this is how we did things is almost always the more valuable framing. So after dispensing all that advice over the years, I felt obliged to come back and share what happened when we did our best to follow our own advice, take our own medicine. So we didn't live up to our ideals in every respect, but overall, I think these methods served us pretty well, and we'll keep coming back to them. So this is how we did things. I hope some nugget in there may be of use to you in your own endeavors. Thank you. While I take any questions, I'll just leave up this screen of various resources and references I mentioned during the talk. Looks like I did not go over time, so any questions? Yeah. Yeah, the question was about what point in the process did we bring in the cultural consultants and how fleshed out was the story. It was pretty much when the whole draft of the script was written. The informal consultation with friends happened just during development, at earlier stages, so when we were still outlining and making major changes to the story. But the plan was always to have the script drafted, get a consultant, get it reviewed, and then as we did our own revisions, be able to incorporate changes at that stage, but before recording. And unfortunately, just because of the way we had blocked out the schedule, we had our voice recording kind of blocked for an unmovable date. It's like, can't change anything after that, at least nothing that is not written down. There's another whole story about how I'm trying to like patch things and add in stuff that we didn't get to through the written diary that Harley keeps, because she keeps a journal. She wants to be a writer. So there's some things you can express by just like writing it down in the journal after the voice actors are all done. But yeah, so it was in that, and we never really got like the whole first draft of the script before jumping into recording. We were kind of like working on it right up to the end. So that also left us with less time, but that's when we hope to do it. Yes. Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of things going on there. I think there is certainly the Mexican or like Spanish speaking character as written by the non-Hispanic person who knows a few words and can throw them in, and that makes it sound, exotic and, authentic to their ear. So we probably were influenced by that, as we're influenced by like all of the media tropes when we imagine our like, Mexican revolutionary general character. He is someone who goes, "Arriba," and like, is like, it says the totally wrong thing. So I'm sure Francisco could speak about this more as being actually bilingual, that, the Spanglish, where you just like kind of fluidly switch back and forth, does not involve like only inserting one word of a sentence or like these quick little soundbite phrases. But yeah, I think the reason that we ended up writing Phil and none of the other characters that way was because we had a Spanish speaker as a writer who could at least write, something a little bit more natural sounding, we thought, and also just still some carryover from those tropes that we kind of inherit that influence how we think of a character like that. I'm sure there's a lot more like really interesting, explorations of the topic if you delve into. I'm sure someone has done the paper on like, investigating why characters like make these shouts in their original language. So. Yes. I think a lot of it was just, again, a spillover from a lock to the writing that was more crunched than we would have wanted in general. And other than the leads that we already had and the outreach that we did, we had to do the recording and had to lock the script at that time. If we were able to move that back at our leisure, I think we definitely would have done the things that I suggested here and looked more places, widened the search. I think, this is obviously like the biggest thing that we failed to do, and just trying to come out and be honest about it and say like, yeah, we messed up there. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.